right, having a quorum, I will open the February 11th, 2010 meeting of the Planning Commission. Mr. Cato, would you please call the roll?
Yes, please. Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge. Here. Commissioner Jordan.
Here.
Commissioner Larson.
Here.
Commissioner Jacobs. Absent. Vice Chair Jostis.
Here.
And Chair Bartlett.
Here. And under preliminary matters, we're doing things a little different this week. We're now reviewing our action item minutes early in the agenda rather than at the end with our administrative work. So we do have our minutes attached. Are there any comments from commissioners on the minutes? Mr. Jostis.
Mr. Chair, I just want to compliment staff on a very concise, to the point, and streamlined version of the minutes. I think they're a nice improvement.
Ms. Lodge.
A couple of typos on page 3, last paragraph. I believe it should be decisions. The Commission expressed confidence in the decisions made by the staff hearing officer, and needs an S added. And on the next page, I apparently reported on twice. It says Commissioner Lodge reported on the Downtown Parking Committee. I think I only did it once.
Great, thank you. Any other comments from the Commission? I have a change
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's all right. I'll save it till the end.
Okay, I have a change on page 2, item D. It should be Commissioner Bartlett opened public comment, and at the end, closed the public comment. Ms. Larson.
I just wanted to acknowledge that I need to abstain from anything after 2:30 that day.
Okay.
Thank you.
Actually, I will need to abstain on item 3, which was the 1213 Harbor Hills Drive. Okay, all those in favor of approval of the minutes as amended?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. Thank you. Mr. Cato, are there any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items that you can report on?
No, there are not.
Any announcements or appeals?
Yes, I have one. I passed out a document that is it's a memo to both the well, it's a lot of people: City Council, City Planning Commission, County Board of Supervisors, and the Montecito Planning Commission, outlining a coordinated review process for Coast Village Road projects. This is something that Paul Casey, the Community Development Director, actually, he's really the Assistant City Administrator, and Betty Weiss, the City Planner, worked on with the county planning staff, and it's outlined on the back, the process. It basically says that any major project that would go to the Planning Commission or to the show, which gets appealed to the Planning Commission, would get a chance to be heard and comments made at the Montecito Planning Commission, and staff would go and make our city staff would go and make a presentation. We would probably ask, well, we will ask 1 to 3 members of the commission to go as well, and then report all that back to the City Planning Commission in the staff report and during the oral presentation as well. So that's something new. It was just finalized basically earlier this week. So that's there for your review.
Any announcements related to the upcoming appeals? I notice we have Sandman coming up in less than a month, and I don't see anybody assigned yet from the commission. So
I thought that we had announced that, but maybe we hadn't. The Sandman project on Upper State Street was appealed, and it's on for March 9th at the City Council.
Right, but do we need a PC representative at the City Council appeal?
We would appreciate one if you could, if you wouldn't mind appointing or volunteering.
I wasn't there, so.
Okay. I could do that, Danny.
Okay.
Okay. At this point, I will open public comment for anything not on today's agenda. If there's anybody in the public that would like to speak. Seeing no one, I will close public comment, and we'll be on to our first item, which is a discussion item, which is the future of the redevelopment agency. And I'm not sure, is it Brian Bossie that's going to be doing the presentation on that? Great.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Planning Commissioners. My name is Brian Bossi, and I am the Housing and Redevelopment Manager for the City of Santa Barbara, and I'm here joined today with Sarah Connect, Assistant City Attorney, as well as Mr. Stephen Falstich, our Housing Program Supervisor. The item before you today, which we will be discussing, was a group effort. This came out of the city's Leadership Academy, and it's a group of 5 folks, including Susie Gonzalez in Human Resources, Lorena Razzo at the Police Department, Rudy Livingston in Finance, Sarah Connect, and myself. But I want to let you know that it went far beyond that. This report, we talked with numerous folks throughout the city, the downtown organization, the various arts groups. We also involved a great deal of city staff in developing this report, including Stephen and his staff, as well as folks in Public Works, the airport, and a number of other departments and divisions. So I just wanted to let you know that there was a collaborative effort. It was put together and presented to department heads in the fall of last year. And what we'd like to do for you today is run through the report with you and let you know what's going on over there at the Housing and Redevelopment Division. So as far as presentation outline, we'll go over some redevelopment basics with you. We'll talk about important dates. We'll go through redevelopment accomplishments, both from a capital improvement side as well as an affordable housing side. We'll look at the redevelopment agency's finances, both past, present, as well as future. We'll look at what our future needs, what we deem to be our future needs at this point, and from there branch into future opportunities, possible opportunities, and then we'll end with a few conclusions. And at that point, we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. So, as far as redevelopment basics, the purpose of redevelopment is to, it's the primary tool used by cities and counties in the state of California to revitalize their downtowns as well as provide affordable housing stock. And it's all based on fighting blight, or the influences that lead to blight. Now, good question is, what is blight? Many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, and even beyond that, when this particular redevelopment agency was formed, that the definition of blight was pretty much whatever you wanted it to be. Whatever you deemed blight was blight. Over the years, it's gotten considerably more restrictive. It's very hard to prove in the current day and time. But the current law says that it's broken up into 2 things, economic blight as well as physical blight. Economic blight includes depreciated or stagnant property values, high business vacancies, low lease rates. Other things include high crime rates, residential overcrowding, anything and other things that happen to affect safety or community health. As far as physical blight is concerned, these are unsafe buildings that are not fit for people to work or live in. They also include land uses, incompatible land uses that don't allow you to fully utilize the land. So those are a couple on the physical side. Well, how do redevelopment agencies fight blight, or the symptoms that lead to blight? Well, money, and it comes from the tax increment financing. And what that is back in, let's see, after post-World War II, the nation as a whole realized that soldiers coming back didn't have adequate housing. There wasn't a good stock of affordable housing. Downtown cores had depreciated. And so what they did was they created redevelopment. And it was primarily financed through federal grants on a year-to-year basis. So what that did was funding kind of went up and down. It was never a consistent form of funding. So actually in 1952, through the state of California had a constitutional amendment that created tax increment financing. So what that is we establish a project area. Back in the early 70s, the city of Santa Barbara establishes their project area. We have an 850-acre project area. Within that project area, at that particular time, it is established the property taxes are called the base year. So let's assume it's $100 million at that particular time. Now that there's a project area, any future increase in that property tax, say it goes up to $110 million, that $10 million is then taken and given back to the redevelopment agency to fund capital improvements only within that project area, as well as provide for affordable housing, both inside the project area as well as throughout the city as a whole. So that's a quickie on tax increment financing. Now, the way that is broken down by law is 80% of that goes towards redevelopment activities, the capital improvements and things of that nature, and a minimum of 20% goes towards the provision of affordable housing. The City Council, which also acts as the redevelopment agency board, has quite often gone beyond that 20% minimum, noting the concerns about affordable housing or the lack of affordable housing in our community. So those are some redevelopment basics. As far as our project area, this is our project area, the Central City Redevelopment Project Area, CCRP as we call it. It goes from Victoria Street on the upper portion of the map, working my way down the left side along the 101 freeway, then goes to Castillo Street towards the bottom half of the graphic, goes down Castillo Street to Shoreline or Cabrillo Boulevard, takes a right, and goes past Harbor Way, the entrance to the harbor. Just a little bit past there, encompasses the entire harbor, including the wharf, comes down the wharf, back to Cabrillo Boulevard, down to Milpas Street, up Milpas Street, to the 101 freeway, back along the 101 freeway to Santa Barbara Street, and then up Santa Barbara Street to Victoria. So 850-acre project area. And again, those capital improvements funded by the 80% have to be within that project area. On occasion, they can be outside of it, but legal findings have to be made. And as far as the affordable housing is concerned, both inside the project area and outside. I want to talk briefly about some redevelopment accomplishments, both on the capital side as well as the affordable housing side. This, believe it or not, is the train depot in the, I believe, 90s. This was a redevelopment funded project along with Caltrans to the tune of about $8 million. And that project was completed in 1999. And this is the current state of the train depot. Within the last 2 years, it has also been listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Here's a group of redevelopment projects, including the State Street Sidewalk Improvement Project, 4-phase project over a number of years that improved the sidewalks, landscaping, pedestrian amenities, et cetera, from the 400 block of State Street up to the 1200 block of State Street. The agency has funded all sorts of projects, both infrastructure as well as community arts groups. They've gone from small to large. On the upper right, albeit a small project and an important one, these are the public restrooms that were developed a few years ago outside of Borders, adjacent to the movie theater. And actually, I got to tell you, that won a regional American Planning Association award for hard-fought victories. So not the most glamorous, but important. On the lower right, you'll see the Granada Garage. This is one of a number of parking garages that the redevelopment agency owns and has developed over the years. Others include at least Structure 2, which is across from Nordstrom's, as well as Parking Structure 10 off of Ortega Street. Some additional redevelopment projects. On the upper left, you'll see the Chase Palm Park Expansion Project. On the right, you will see East Cabrillo Boulevard Sidewalk Improvement Project. I should also let you know that right now we're currently down on the western portion of Cabrillo Boulevard doing the West Beach Pedestrian Improvement Project. We also received funding in the fall to address the other side of Milpas Street on Cabrillo Boulevard down to the Cabrillo Arts Pavilion. So in about a year here, we'll have all new sidewalks and landscaping along the entire waterfront. And in the lower center portion of the slide is Paseo Nuevo, another redevelopment project. As for housing projects, they have been many over the years, and all of them honestly quite amazing. Stephen Falstich has been with the city for many years and has actually had his hand involved in each and every one of those. We have wonderful folks we work with, Stephen and his staff, but also outside the city organization, our various affordable housing providers People's Self-Help Housing, the Community Housing Corporation, as well as, of course, the Housing Authority of Santa Barbara. This is Milagro de Ladera. It's on the Lower West Side. This is before photo, and the moisture you see there isn't a leaky hose. That's actually raw sewage. This is Milagro de Ladera after the affordable housing, after the redevelopment agency came in with funds and worked with People's Self-Help. This has actually won a number of awards, including national awards. Additional housing, affordable housing accomplishments, St. Vincent's on the upper left. This has 75 family units as well as 95 senior units. It's a beautiful place, recently opened, officially opened in the fall of last year. Then on the upper right, you have Casa de las Fuentes, a housing authority project of 42 units in our downtown. The lower right is Garden Court, another housing authority, City of Santa Barbara project, which includes 98 small studio units for very low income, frail elderly. And on the lower left is El Carrillo, one of our more recent projects. It has 62 studio units. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Huell Hauser actually did a segment, and he dedicated it all to El Carrillo, and we have it on our website, so please check it out. And it's one of the few, actually, Huell has called our staff on a number of occasions and talked about what a wonderful project is, and over all the years he's done his thing, this is one that really touched him the most. So that's pretty darn impressive. So wonderful work on the housing side of things. So through the years, the redevelopment agency has received more than $255 million in tax increment funding, and that's through fiscal year 2009. Approximately $204 million of that has been invested in the Central City redevelopment project area, including over $52 million since 2000. Additionally, approximately $51 million has been invested in affordable housing, and I should let you know that that $51 million also leveraged well above an additional $100 million in project funds for various projects over the years. And what that equates to, numbers-wise, is roughly 8% of the housing stock in the city of Santa Barbara is considered affordable housing. And that doesn't include an additional 3%, which is subject to Section 8 HUD vouchers. So depending on how you want to look at it, it's upward, could be up to 11% of the city's housing stock is considered affordable. Now, as we went through and gathered all these numbers and facts and figures, it was amazing to see redevelopment and the impact it's had not only on the capital side of things and the affordable housing side of things, but also outside of that. Over the years, the Redevelopment Agency Board has granted over $13 million to community organizations, a lot of them arts organizations, things like $5 million to the Granada Theater, numerous grants to the Libero Theater, the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation, Center Stage Theater, the Alacama Theater, it goes on and on. So quite a contribution to the local community. We also work very closely with our downtown organization and have funded a number of things with them, including cultural arts development to the tune of about $75,000 per year. We also help them and the County Arts Commission start the very successful First Thursday program, which is wonderful for the downtown. Also, bringing it back to the city side of things, the city organization, when we do a project and it gets to the construction phase, we essentially hire Public Works Engineering to do the project management. And over the last 3 fiscal years, that has averaged almost $750,000 per year that is paid out to the Public Works Department. So that's a significant amount of income for them. That's a number of engineers, however you want to break it down. We also do the same with our Parks and Rec staff when we have parks-related projects, whether they be restrooms or, for example, the Carrillo Recreation Center and what we're doing over there. So that's an impact for them as well. And currently we have approximately 15 full-time equivalents in the Housing and Redevelopment Division. So the reason I put that up there is once the redevelopment agency goes away, it's not just the capital improvements that will stop, the affordable housing that will stop. It's the impact goes far beyond that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah for a few slides regarding some important dates.
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Chairman and members of the Planning Commission, as Mr. Bossi mentioned, my name is Sarah Connect, and I'm an assistant city attorney, and I've been working with the redevelopment agency for the past 5 or 6 years. And I just want to go back for a minute on what Mr. Bossi mentioned about tax increment financing. There's an element to that needs to be mentioned briefly, and that is that one of the principles behind tax increment financing is that it's not intended to be a source for cash to be accumulated and held by a redevelopment agency. The principle behind redevelopment is that the increased property tax revenue be used on capital projects that eliminate blight and provide affordable housing opportunities. So the law requires that any tax increment that an agency is entitled to is limited by the amount of debt that that agency has established. And every year we submit to the county auditor a statement of indebtedness, and it's based upon that statement of indebtedness that we get our tax increment. So you would never get more than the amount that you have established debt for. And that includes long-term debt. Bond financing is one of the principal ways that capital is obtained by the agency so that it can fund projects that it needs that it needs right now, and then pay back the bond proceeds with the tax increment over years. So one of the first deadlines that we have already passed, which is driving why the redevelopment agency is kind of slowly going out of business, if you will, is that in 2003 the agency was after 2003, the agency could no longer establish new debt. So all the debt that was on the books at that time is what we were limited to in the future. And at that time, we had enough accumulated debt to, at that point, equal what the cumulative tax increment cap that we set for ourselves a number of years ago. And that cap is $431 million. So in 2003, we had an equivalent amount of debt already established and fixed. The bonds that are part of that cumulative tax increment will be paid off around 2015. So that time period has already come and gone. The next period that's important, and Brian, you can go to the next, is that the statute provides that redevelopment agency project areas have a lifespan of 40 years. So our agency was formed in 1972. 40 years would have put us in 2012. We've been granted 3 one-year extensions based upon this shift where the state has taken some redevelopment money over the years and funneled it to school districts. In exchange for that, we've been given 1-year extensions. Of course, I might add that did not apply to the shift this year or next year. Did it last year? I can't remember if we got it next year or last year. We did. Okay. So, but what happens in 2015 is the project area expires. The redevelopment agency itself will continue to be a viable public entity, and it can still take action on projects that have already been created. So we have a number of ongoing obligations. We have a number of contracts. All those things will continue. But what that does mean is that since redevelopment agencies can only spend tax increment on capital projects within the project area, no new capital projects can be started after that period of time. However, since affordable housing projects can actually be constructed anywhere within the jurisdiction, we could probably still continue with some new projects there. But in any event, the redevelopment agency will remain a viable public entity for at least 10 years beyond the 2015 date. And we will continue to receive tax increment. And in fact, we will receive tax increment until the first of one of three things happens. And the first would be that we would reach our $431 million tax increment cap. And as Mr. Bossi will explain in a little while, that could either be between 2016 and 2019. So we are, in fact, approaching that limit. The other thing that could happen would be that we would pay off all of our debt. Now, if we've done this right, those two will occur at the same time. And then finally, there is a statutory maximum period of time, and that would be 2025. So if none of those things have occurred first, we will, certainly the agency will have to wind up in 2025. So at that time, in 2025, the agency can get no more tax increment, the agency can pay no more debt, so the agency winds up. Now, the other thing that is interesting about these deadlines, and I just want to point out, too, that Santa Barbara is one of the oldest redevelopment agencies in the state and will be one of the first ones to end. And the Redevelopment Association considers our agency to be one of the most successful in the state. And I'm sure you can see why. There's very little blight remaining in the downtown core. We've done a lot. We've built a lot of affordable housing. But many agents, so what Mr. Bossi and I have been studying through this project is really no other agencies have approached these deadlines yet. The statutes are not clear, so some of this is theoretical, or not theoretical, but we're not absolutely sure about, what is going to happen at certain points of time. And one of the things that's interesting is that the redevelopment agency law provides that if an agency is about to bump up against any of these deadlines and they have not met their affordable housing requirements or have not paid their bonded debt particularly, then all of these deadlines and even their tax increment cap are postponed. So that's interesting to us, although at this point in time we will certainly have all of our debt paid and we will meet our affordable housing requirements. As an early agency, the only affordable housing requirement that this agency is affected with is the 20% set aside of tax increment. And that 20% has to be spent on low and moderate income housing only, cannot be spent on middle income housing. But agencies that were formed later than ours or agencies that have done certain things that have triggered these newer statutory requirements are required to meet housing production requirements. And those requirements are that within a project area, an agency must commit 30% of its housing to low and moderate income, and 15% of the new or rehabilitated housing within the project area developed by public agencies or private parties have to be low and moderate affordable income housing. So we've never been subject to those requirements, and I'm going to touch on this a little bit more later on when Brian and I come back to some of our recommendations for possible future activities.
Okay, so finances, where are we? This is a quick little spreadsheet, basically grouped into 5-year increments for the most part, that shows where we've been going as a redevelopment agency. On the far right, you'll see the percentage, in all cases, an increase over the previous 5 years. So obviously, we continue to go up, 105%, 62%, 9%, 45%, 44%. And what that results in is a total, to date, tax increment accumulation of $255 million. The last line there is just we decided to pull out the 2009. Last year we received right at $20 million in tax increment revenues. So again, tax increment cap was established in 1987 as $431,130,000. Big number, enormous number. Probably thought we'd never hit it. But the downtown project area has been successful. Property values have continuously gone up, not so much lately, but we are approaching that cap. Currently, through fiscal year 2009, you'll see I have here $232 million. It's a little different than the $255 on the previous screen, and the reason there is when we established this cap in 1987, everything leading up to 87 didn't count towards the cap. So that's an interesting little tweak. So we essentially got away with about $20 million in tax increment revenue that we didn't have to put towards our total. Nonetheless, projected tax increment revenue growth at a very, very conservative 2% growth rate will hit that cap in 2019. Again, that's the same time that those two bonds we have out will be paid off. And that was structured that particular way when we did those bonds back in 2001 and 2003. 3% growth rate will hit that cap in 2018. And the 7% growth rate, which is probably more in line with what we do on a year-to-year basis. We've seen everything in the past 5 years, 12% to 7% and everywhere in between. So 7% is a pretty good growth rate, standard growth rate for us. We would hit that cap of $431 million in 2017. So noting that we have these deadlines approaching, we decided to look at on the successes that have happened and all that the redevelopment agency has done in the past. What are our future needs? What of this redevelopment agency do we need to continue for the city and the community? First, capital improvements. Again, we've spent $204 million in the project area on various capital improvements. Probably even more important is the affordable housing component. Again, $51 million in affordable housing, leveraged much more than that. 8% of the existing housing stock is considered affordable. And then a third need is the community grants and arts grants. Again, $13 million that the agency board has granted to various organizations over the years. So with that in mind, what our needs were, we tried to develop some future opportunities to pursue. They include the development of new redevelopment agency project areas, possible plan amendments to increase our tax increment cap, extend our expiration date, as well as focus, maybe a tweak to focus on affordable housing. A third is a transition to a community projects and housing division. So essentially taking the existing housing and redevelopment division and transition it into a community projects and housing division. And a fourth is special districts. And for the purposes of our discussion here today, we're not going to touch on that. It's talking special districts, we're talking about things like Mello-Roos, Benefit Assessment District, various bond possibilities and things like that. Really things that are more of a city-wide issue or something that the city would possibly take on. So we're going to focus on the first three bullets. So new project areas. Remember, the main thing that redevelopment agency does, in addition to affordable housing, is fighting blight. So again, what is blight? We're looking at the economic side of blight. We're also looking at the physical blight as well as economic blight. Again, physical blight, buildings that are of substandard nature, building code violations, incompatible land uses and things like that. Economic blight, again, stagnant property values, low lease rates, business vacancies, things along those lines. So what we did is we searched and we came up with 4 possible new project areas. And what we did is we went through those and applied existing blight standards to those, and I will run through those. First is the west side and lower west side. We then looked out at the airport. We looked at the Milpas corridor, and we also looked at the Haley and Gutierrez corridors. So as far as the west side and lower west side, this would be the proposed project area we were looking at would be Mission Street on the upper portion. We'd come roughly down Chino Street on the west, moving down with the 101 on the east. We'd kind of come down, hop over Carrillo, include that as well, and catch that lower west downtown area that ends at Castillo and West Montecito Street at the base of the hill from City College. Now, an overview of blighting conditions. We tried to apply the existing blight conditions, and we couldn't come up with much. For example, the building, I took this photo in the fall, the building on the right is actually had significant tenant improvements, and I believe now is almost ready for occupation. The photo on the left, I'll admit, it was trash day. That was as good as I could do. So that's why the trash cans are out there. That's not the normal state. So as far as blight, physical blight, couldn't really find it in terms of the law. Economic blight, you've got a number of restaurants, gas stations, hardware stores, market, and things that a community of that size would need. So we couldn't really make the justification there. We think there might be some wiggle room here, and this is definitely the one out of all of these that we would possibly looking at pursuing. The airport. This has long been a discussion, the idea of creating a redevelopment project area out there. The airport is primarily the north side. The area we're looking at is the north side of Hollister. It's about 95 acres, and about 88 of those acres are leasable space. The entire 95-acre portion is city-owned. That creates an issue as far as tax increment revenue because government agencies don't pay property tax. However, the leaseholders do pay possessory interest tax, and so that amounts to, back in 2007, about $500,000, which could service some amount of a bond to do capital improvements in the area. However, when we applied the blighting conditions out there, couldn't find much. For example, again, 88 of those acres are leasable spaces. They have reasonable lease rates, and they generate over $2.8 million annually, and this was back in 2007, of income, so a significant amount of revenue. Also, back in 2001, the airport department made a number of significant improvements to the tune of about $5.8 million, sidewalks, streets, communication, sewer. So they really put the infrastructure in there for additional leases and things like that. So couldn't really find a whole lot of blight out there. Next, we turned our attention to the Milpas corridor, and here we're talking about the area roughly 13 blocks from Cabrillo Boulevard up to Cannon Perdido Street. This is an area that's very active, high traffic volume, high pedestrian volume, everything from hotels and motels down in the lower portion. You've got markets and everything in between. So a lot of mixed use throughout the corridor. In general, it does not meet the definition of economic blight. It contains properties that are almost entirely leased, reasonable lease rates, decent property values, and also things that are normally found in neighborhoods of this size. This was discussed a lot in the late 1990s for a project area, and we actually went out and had a very well-regarded consultant team, redevelopment consultant team, come up and look at the proposed project area. I think they had lunch and left because basically they couldn't find it. They said the area, and it's thriving economically, and for the eastern part of Santa Barbara, it's the core of that area, socially, economically, culturally, very active and vibrant corridor. And a lot of people continue to think that it's a good space or a good place for a project area, and compare it to State Street, but it's not State Street. It serves its purpose, and it does very well at doing just that. It serves the community very well. The fourth area we looked at was the Haley and Gutierrez corridors, basically from State Street over to Milpas. Very highly traveled, high vehicle volume as well as pedestrian volume. In terms of blighting conditions, doesn't meet the general definition of economic blight. The properties are almost entirely leased, decent lease rates, good property values. As far as so that's the economic side. Infrastructure is fine as well. So although it's not the prettiest place, it serves its purpose, and it's very active. So those are the four project areas we looked at, and now Mrs. Connect is going to look at some legislation.
Thanks, Brian. We wanted to take a look at first what kind of legislation was already on the books that might allow us the opportunity to extend some of these, some of the dates. And first we looked at, there's an existing law that would allow a redevelopment agency to get 10 more years of life. However, that statute does not allow an increase in the tax increment cap. And without an increase in the tax increment cap, it doesn't do us a lot of good. No more tax increment, we couldn't really do anything. So we needed to think about ways that we might want to pursue some legislative changes. And the feeling is that for general redevelopment agency purposes, capital projects, really there is not much legislative intent to extend any of the deadlines. I think there's a pretty big push in Sacramento right now to take back redevelopment agency funds. Every year we're losing a significant amount now that's being taken back by Sacramento and funneled into the schools or other places to bridge the budget gap. So we don't think that there's much opportunity to extend the dates generally, but what we do find interesting is the opportunities with regard to affordable housing. And I mentioned in my original speech that redevelopment agencies that have not met their required housing production standards by the time that they either expire or hit their cap will be able to get more tax increment, will be able to extend their lives until they do reach those requirements. So we thought, well, is there any way that the Santa Barbara Redevelopment Agency might be able to develop an affordable housing plan where we voluntarily impose those requirements on ourselves? And in that way, we could then maybe get some new legislation on the books that would allow us to increase our tax increment cap and extend the deadlines in order to be able to fulfill those requirements. Now, the primary problem here is that those are self-imposed would be self-imposed obligations instead of legally mandated obligations. But we think that there's an opportunity maybe to pursue some legislation where a redevelopment agency could impose an affordable housing plan and that way extend the tax increment cap and the life of the plan. So that's our most viable legislative approach that we're considering at this time.
Okay, and then the third possibility we developed was the transition of to a new division, the Housing and Redevelopment Division to a new division. It can be any name, but we chose to call it Community Projects and Housing Division. And so what this is what we'd be looking at is taking what the redevelopment agency has done based on the decisions made by the agency board, the very good decisions over the years that have resulted in the many projects that the community benefits from. So how do we continue that? The Housing and Redevelopment Division has really good relationships with our business community, the downtown organization, the arts community, the social service agencies, the affordable housing developers, and so on. And so how do we keep that going? And those relationships were very important in many of these projects in getting them through. So our idea was to transition into this new division. So it would function much like the existing Housing and Redevelopment Division, including it would continue the affordable housing development. It would also continue the community development block grant implementation, as well as the capital project development. Well, that's the similarities, and that's where they end. The difference here is that how it would be much different than the Housing and Redevelopment Division of today is that in regards to the affordable housing development, target low and moderate income via the 20% set aside. This would allow us, because we wouldn't be subject to California Community Redevelopment Law, this would allow us to fund all those other priorities in housing, whatever they are at that time. You could fund the workforce housing, which we can't now. You'd be able to fund other levels of income housing. So it just opens up a little bit, gives you a little bit more flexibility as far as affordable housing funding is concerned. In terms of capital project development, Instead of being confined to the 850-acre project area, we would be able to do projects outside of that project area throughout the city. So the idea would be to strengthen those relationships we already have, as well as engage the neighborhood organizations and the community as a whole, and put together lists of what is needed out there. All good ideas, they need money. And so what we have thought of was, when the redevelopment agency eventually goes away, let's just assume it'll be more than this, but let's just assume for numbers' sake, our last year we take in $20 million of tax increment revenue. Well, that money now goes away, goes back to the county. They take the majority of it. The schools get a portion of it, probably between $1 and $2 million, I believe is what they're estimating. And then a number of other taxing agencies get that. So obviously it's going to help all of those different taxing agencies. What eventually comes back to the city out of that proposed $20 million would be about $4 million. So our thought here to fund this particular division at some level would be for the city council at some point down the road to make a policy decision to take that $4 million or whatever it is, or a version of it, take that and fund this particular division so that they could continue to do move along the successes of the existing redevelopment agency, obviously on a much smaller scale, but continue along that path and make it a more citywide program. So that's the third option we have. So with that, what we thought of, conclusions, things we really need to follow up on and over the next 5 years really take a hold of and explore. The idea of new project areas. Again, we're not real confident in this one. The one, again, that does have maybe a glimmer of hope is, in our eyes, is the West Downtown, Lower West Downtown. So we'll be looking into that. Legislative changes, as was just mentioned by Sarah. And then finally, the transition to a community projects and housing division. So those are some ideas. Not the end-all, be-all. I'm sure maybe we'll come up with some more as time goes on, but that's what we have at this time, and thought we'd share that with you today. So that concludes our formal presentation. We're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great, thank you very much. Are there questions from the commission? Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. I just want to be clear that once an area, and I'm thinking of the lower Milpas area, an area that hasn't quite benefited as much from the existing RDA as some other places have, but once it's been drawn in the boundary of an RDA, it cannot be in that kind of position again. There can't be a lower Milpas RDA that initiates after the expiration of the current RDA.
So if I understand the question, just cutting out a portion, for example, in this case, lower Milpas area.
Or redrawing it, the part of Milpas that you looked at doesn't really qualify for blight, but the southern portion of Milpas is more likely to, and yet it's in our current RDA. So is it possible to create a new RDA that has within its boundaries a portion of land that has been in a previous RDA?
That's a good question. In the project area we proposed for Milpas did include that. You're suggesting just carving that lower portion out.
I am.
I'm not sure, but I can tell you that knowing that we have 5 more years left and knowing that not a whole lot has happened down there, we do have some projects in the queue who have sought redevelopment agency funding. A number of them are very big on council's agenda that include lower Milpas improvements, including sidewalks, landscaping, to address, I think, just exactly what you're talking about, at least along the corridor there. As far as exploring another project area, I'm not aware of overlapping project areas or one project area ending and then a new project area that also encompasses part of the old one. I'm not sure exactly how that works. That's an interesting question. Sarah might have a little more to say on that.
Thanks, Commissioner Jacobs. My thought on that is I don't see any reason why you couldn't do that as long as you could establish blight, meeting the current requirements for blight, and that would be really a parcel-by-parcel determination. But if you could find blight that met the state requirements, once this existing project area expires, I don't see any reason why you couldn't just draw the boundaries and create a new one. But again, you'd have to meet the current standards, which are significantly more rigorous than they were in 1972.
I still suspect that part of our city would qualify more than some other parts that you suggested, and it's really struggled and not benefited, as has the above the freeway part of the RDA. So I would say keep that one in the hopper. Thanks.
Mr. Jordan, I believe you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a similar question, only had a different area in mind. When you had the project area map up, I was more thinking, and you can tell me I'm wrong, Brian, because everybody else does, but lower State Street below the freeway and east, staying below the freeway, all the way down to Milpas, essentially, if you stay off the waterfront. But that would incorporate what is it's kind of a contradictory, a vibrant area, maybe economically, where the urban wine trail is, but there's no sidewalks, there's no parking. The infrastructure itself is horrible, and you continue that down as you go down on Olive, on Lower Olive, on Salsapuedes or Cali Cesar Chavez, and then when you finally breach down into where the backsides off of Milpas, where Esperanza is, some of those same thing, no sidewalks, no areas, a lot of shuttered houses and buildings, but I see that that's already been in the zone also, and that to me would be, if you were a way to incorporate Lower Milpas and back into that zone too, it would just seem to me either I don't know about projects that have taken place there, or certainly it's been weighted to the downtown corridor and at maybe the expense of some of these areas that are just starting to come into their own.
Commissioner Jordan, that's a great question. Those are great ideas. And you're right. Primarily the funding the redevelopment agency capital funding has gone more towards the downtown corridor. And realizing that over the last 7 to 8 years, the agency board has made a conscious move, shifting over, looking at the west downtown neighborhoods. We've got a project on Anapamu and Ortega that's improving those two corridors from the west-west side over to State Street. We've also got the west beach pedestrian improvements. So they are branching out with decisions, realizing that other areas need to be taken care of. As far as the area of Lower State Street, we know what's going on or what's not going on down there, or what could be happening down there. That would significantly change the activity, obviously. As far as the Funk Zone and working your way over to Milpas, agreed, there are some spots in there with poor sidewalks or poor drainage, similar to a lot of parts of our city, that could be addressed. Vacancy rates, depending on when you're there, can be higher or lower. As far as a general trend, it's statewide, it's not too bad. And you're seeing a lot more of those wine boutiques popping up. And so it is getting some activity, but those are great points. And I think, again, those were 4 areas that we looked at, but carving out different areas is something we're definitely interested in. We like to see these continued improvements for as long as we possibly can. So it's something that we can definitely look into.
In some cases, it becomes a chicken and an egg argument, too, because as a place becomes, if you want to call it lower economic strata, rent or commercial, they're full and thriving, but it's at such a low rent rate that's the reason there is, and it's guys storing boats and stuff like that, but they're fully rented and leased. So it's a circle that at some time you have to break out of. I was glad to hear you mention the downtown organization. As you know, I get to have breakfast with you once a month for the past year or so, and in talking about the new division, I'd just like to say personally I'm impressed with your guys' operation and the way you do engage and involve that particular organization, and I'm sure others. And I think that's in the description of talking about one of the possibilities and how you would transition. I think that will be key, and I think you've done a fantastic job in building that foundation so far with that particular group and probably others. And that frequently in other areas I see, whether it's trash or water or marijuana or something, those you certainly have set a better foundation in place on how that should happen and be engaging than other city departments. And I think you should be congratulated for that. And I hope that that's one of the viable choices to move towards that new position, and that'll, of course, depend upon 7 votes or 7 people voting to move that way. And I kind of think if that vote was held today, it might be trouble because somebody would just look at that $4 million and want it. But I would encourage you to stay engaged, because I think the key to that is to make sure that the community players put the pressure on the political voting process. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jostis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions. One has to do with Mission Creek, which runs through a majority of the project area. And there's a Army Corps project scheduled for that that's been held up for years, if not a decade now. And I was curious what you see as, is there an ability to utilize redevelopment funds to kind of complement what the Corps does in that particular area? Because I go back to my old CCRP Finally IR of the 70s, and I look at these maps, and it's a trip through history, my word. But what can the redevelopment agency do to help piece together that necklace of open space? And that's what it's kind of referred to in the redevelopment plan.
Commissioner Jostes, that's a great question, and it is one that we are addressing at the current time. Back in, I can't recall which bond issue it was either the 2001 or 2003, the agency board, as part of that bond, set aside, I believe it was, I want to say $3.5 million to help with the purchase of open space, improvements beyond what the Army Corps was proposing, not just straight concrete walls, but aesthetically pleasing things to help with that project. Since that time, the redevelopment agency has purchased 2 properties on Bath and Ortega, on the corner of Bath and Ortega Street. We're currently renting those out as affordable units. But when the time comes and the bridge adjacent to there is replaced as part of the core project, those buildings will be raised, and eventually Parks is going to come in and create an open space area along. There are a couple other properties along there too. Public Works purchased one, we purchased 2, and to go through the core is supposed to purchase the rest and make that whole entire corner more of an open space park environment. Noting that that's severely lacking in the West Downtown area. Additionally, we have been working with our Public Works as well as the Army Corps, County Flood, to promote the project. Last year, there was a small part of it that took place down at the train depot. They did a small chunk, but we've also the agency board has also set aside $2.5 million to help with the portion of the project that actually runs through, not the depot itself, but the parking lot and around the fig tree, through that parking lot, and connects on the other side of the 101. So the movement has started. They've set aside that money. Public Works knows it there, and we're using that, quite honestly, as a carrot to keep it moving. So with that, I think it's I'm not an engineer, sorry. So it's a high flow channel, which in storms like we've recently had, the water can also travel through there and not have the flooding that we've had in the past. So we are looking at opportunities to assist with the Mission Creek project as best we can and keep it moving, keep that progress going.
Okay. The second thing comes back to the funk zone, and that's been a really interesting part of this city over the past 20, 25 years, and it seems as though when developments come across our desks, we're looking to applicants to do the obvious nexus improvements to the sidewalk, curb and gutter, all of that kind of stuff. Do you have any sources of optimism in terms of things that might happen in the funk zone between now and the sunset of the redevelopment agency that would expedite the process of bringing some of that connectivity back together, again with the pedestrian master plan, some of those discontinuous sidewalks, giving that area a shot in the arm to be what it can be, and not have the gift of public funds thing stare us in the face?
That's another great question. You know, we're always looking for opportunities to either assist with projects the best we can. For example, along Chapala Street, we had the 2 larger condominium developments a few years ago that were required to improve just maybe their street frontage or their street corner in accordance with the Chapala Street guidelines, which is also something the redevelopment agency put together. But so the redevelopment agency board made the decision to go beyond that and fix the other corners adjacent to those. So at Chapala and De La Guerra, you'll see that whole intersection was improved. The developer did one portion, the RDA did the other 2 portions. In that case, it was a 3-sided deal. Lower down the street, we improved the additional 3 street corners in addition to Chapala 1. Yes. So we do look for those opportunities when somebody is out there developing. If there's a nexus and we can get out there and help and make the entire area, give it a shot in the arm, we do try and do that and move those things forward. So as far as the Funk Zone, I'm not aware exactly of any major projects down there. I know we've seen a lot of improvements over the last couple of years, whether it be Channel Islands or bike shops and the wineries going in. So I'm hoping that continues. We are working with some folks to create more of a pedestrian flow from some of our Garden Street parking lot. There's some wineries on the back side of that to maybe open that up to get a paseo moving through there, and we're working with Henry Lenny on that. So things like that, we try and jump on, definitely.
All right. The redevelopment agency is such a success story. I mean, it's just so obvious with the 8% housing increase, the way you leverage and use your increment financing to pony up some significant inflows in terms of your bond financing. It's just a remarkable vehicle. It works so well. It's just great.
Thank you, Mr. Joestes. Ms. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have 2 things. As I was going through the report and the materials we had, and thinking back to how I think of the redevelopment agency, it came to mind that I'm always looking for opportunity sites for the city to land bank. And I was wondering about armories or maybe the Earl Warren. The state's probably going to look at getting rid of surplus property. And I was wondering if the RDA is set up to do any of that. And the second thing is, well, actually, there's 3 things. The second thing is, in a neighborhood such as the West Side, which maybe wouldn't qualify for being blighted, but I can assure you, because I drive through there all the time, sometimes walk through there, that neighborhood is so heavily pedestrian that any improvements would be appreciated, really. And if you want to see families out in the street, that's where you go to see them, pushing the strollers and navigating their way around utility poles and all kinds of stuff in the way. There is opportunity there. Just because the businesses are occupied doesn't mean that there's not ways to make life really great there. And maybe it's not RDA. I just have my eye on it, though, for things like undergrounding and really upgrading the neighborhood just for the residents, not necessarily, just to keep it viable for the next increment of time. And I'm sure that applies to other neighborhoods, but that's the one I'm the most familiar with. The other thing is, I was really excited when I saw Capital Projects, the police department, because, that tickles through the Planning Commission every once in a while, and we have field tripped it. I think I've been there twice, once on ABR and once on Planning Commission. But, that's a real necessity and the core of health and safety in the city, fire and police. I'm really pleased to see that in the report and pleased to see that that's not being ignored because, it's always in the back of our minds in some way or another, but it's not like we can reach out and find the money ourselves. So I think that's real positive, and I just root for that to stay there and to go forward, even more importantly, not just have it remain an abstract thought, but really help the police get a home that fits them somehow. So I think it's done great positive things, and I'm looking forward to more, however you figure out how to do it. I mean, it's a wonderful thing. So, and what really also pleases me is is how through the city personnel, seeing you folks here, seeing how that the RDA is engaging some very bright people, and I'm appreciative of the time and the energy and your talents that you put in, because it shows, and it's nice that we share a concern and have it go fruitfully forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Larson. Ms. Schwartz?
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. First, I would like to echo a comment of Commissioner Justice that the RDA is a phenomenal success story, and I want to thank you both for this very comprehensive report, because I think it tells this tremendous story both qualitatively and quantitatively. And I want to expand on some comments of Commissioner Jacobs and Jordan, going back to the lower Milpas down through the Funk Zone. If we cannot, so perhaps this is to misconnect because this may be of a legal nature. If we cannot currently demonstrate or prove that some of these areas, even if pulled out today from our existing project area, are blighted under the new kind of harder to prove, higher threshold of proving it, is there a way to make a case for them being at risk of sliding into blight if there is not a proactive, long-term RDA-like strategy to continue improvements? Because I think we've seen with various neighborhoods, block by block in some cases, that if we don't continue to take steps towards ensuring progress, they do become at risk. And there is a way for them to regress and slide backwards. And then there can be that slippery slope, I think, of it being too late at a point when maybe then we don't have the financial resources to step in, and then it's a further regression or a move in a direction that we don't, is not productive for the community. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ms. Knecht?
Thank you, Commissioner. My thought would be that I think that's a very good idea. And right now, the way the statute is written, it has a list of criteria that each parcel has to meet in order to be considered blighted and therefore subject to being within a redevelopment project area. But, I think that could be one of the possible means to promote some new legislation, because certainly that is viable. And only by redeveloping those properties can you then increase the property tax base and then generate that tax increment. So I think that's a great idea.
And if I can add to that, you bring up a very good point, is that not only us, but in other redevelopment agencies, when they do sunset, what then happens to these areas that they've been funding improvements for so many years? Obviously, cities, counties, the state, the nation, everybody's strapped for money, and so you're not going to see those types of improvements continually occurring. So you think about it out a while, and there's a very good chance that it could possibly go back into decline. So what do you do then? I guess my grandchildren will be redevelopment specialists and things like that. I'm not quite sure, but it raises a good question as to how all these different communities in the state are going to have to deal with this at one point or another. And they'll probably look to places like us as examples as to how hopefully we can continue to do that. So it's an interesting discussion.
Mr. Chair, just
one more?
Yeah, one
That's
more.
fine.
I think it's perhaps easy to slide into a feeling of complacency that some of the areas within the project area or sub-areas are well on their way to improvement. We've invested, we see some forward change, but we also have some significant stalled out projects, commercial projects in some of these areas. Some of the delay, we don't know how long some of the delays will occur in terms of completion of those projects, and then seeing the economic sort of fruition for the community, for the city. And depending upon how long those projects continue to remain stalled out, I think the risk that I was talking about elevates. We're then on a different trajectory for the vulnerability of these areas of the city. Whereas we had hopes and we thought we were moving in a positive direction, But when some of these occur, including Fess Parker's boutique hotel down in that area of the Funk Zone, who knows when that's going to be sort of resuscitated and well on its way to completion and then economic contribution to the city and that neighborhood. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Ms. Larson, I believe you have another comment? Oh. Ms. Lodge, I think, is first, and then Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. Like Mr. Justice, I'm going back to the 1970s. I didn't know you'd saved your copy of CCR. I didn't realize that the redevelopment agency had been formed the year before I was first appointed to the Planning Commission in 1973. And I want to echo the comments of those of us who've been around for a while about how successful the redevelopment agency has been. And there was a period of time where the tax increment was growing and growing and growing, and the agency hadn't done anything yet. But it was because property values were going up, and so the revenue was going up. But the agency certainly has done a lot. And at the time, the concern was a dying downtown. Not only the blight in where Presidio Springs is. I believe that was the first project. Was it? Does anyone remember? Presidio Springs, and that was truly a decaying housing area in the redevelopment agency. And by the way, originally there was a separate board that was the redevelopment agency, and I can't remember when the city council took it back over or took it over. But the original impetus was a dying downtown, which was happening to so many communities. La Cumbre Plaza had gone in, and there were continual threats of what became Camino Real, but many years later out in the Goleta Valley when we'd already revitalized downtown, and so that our downtown has remained a vital place. I'm also very proud of the fact that the redevelopment agency, long before there was any state requirement about the amount of money that had to go to affordable housing, has been putting 20% and more. My recollection is sometimes it was 30 or even 40% of the tax increment went to affordable housing. So congratulations to everyone that's ever been involved. And I think some very good suggestions have been made here. Mr. Jordan, Ms. Schwartz, and others about possible work in the Funk Zone and over toward Milpas. Ms. Schwartz, I think you were probably thinking about a project on West Yananali, so a live-work project that got started and is just sitting there and is moldering away in the rain. And part of the issue is, simply the recession, and the developer apparently ran out of funds to finish the project. But that is leading to a blighted look. I don't know, can we hang our hat on that? But I hope we can find some ways to continue the good work of the agency. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. I thought we were doing questions and then comments, so I didn't give my comments, and I definitely have some, both short-term and long-term. As we look down the few years left and what capital is there, prioritizing some of these issues becomes important. And I would put the police facilities at the top of that list and get our force into some really good physical space, because our police station is overcrowded. I don't know if you've toured it. You have. Well, then you know what I'm talking about. The locker rooms are substandard. Our police force deserves much better. Plus, we're spending money to rent space from private entities, and that's just money going out the door. So if our RDA can improve our police station, that would be money well spent in the short term. Also, transit. How the trolley will be funded after the RDA is gone is something that I am concerned about. The success of downtown is largely a success of creating a pedestrian-friendly environment, and that's partly having the parking lots, but it's also having the easy access to to a trolley and to just the ambience that creates that says this is a pedestrian area. So I would make that a high priority in the next couple of years to find a way to continue the trolley service and to continue to look at other transit-oriented improvements. The transit village or the transit center got batted around pretty substantially, and now it's on hold. It's too bad because it was a good idea, but I think it was in the wrong place. And whether it becomes something that the city takes up again or not, I don't know. But it was unfortunate that the timing was lost for that because it was a good idea. Thirdly, our culture and recreation facilities. I'm glad to see an arts master plan is starting to be proposed, and I hope that any kind of startup or momentum that can be built through the RDA that can help that project continue out into the future. Arts and culture really need all the support they can get, especially in these days of economic downturn when disposable income is not as good as it sometimes is. In thinking about the mapping of potential areas, we've already talked about the Lower Milpas area, and two commissioners also brought up the stalled out projects on Lower State Street. Is it blight or not? If Tony Romasanta was here, he could tell us exactly why. It would probably qualify as blighted, at least in his terminology. And I kind of wish that we had that perspective, because when I go through the below the freeway area, I see a lot of out of commission properties. They're functioning below the level they could be at. They're halfway built or not built at all. They're homeless camps. I would keep thinking about that map below the freeway. And if I had stretched above the freeway, I'd stretch it up in only one place, and that's to grab Ortega Park. Ortega Park is a blighted area. It is it's a turf war for gangs. It is an area that should be a great resource for the families and children, of which there are many in that area, and it's not. It's a area that needs attention, and the city should put it back on the map in terms of things that need to be fixed. Two more items. The ongoing priority for affordable housing. I wish that the city would just stop for now with promotion of ownership middle-income housing. Our need for long-term fixed rent housing is so great. To continue to invest the city's resources, both tangible and intangible, in ownership-based middle-income housing is wrong-headed in my thinking. I think we need to just put that aside for now and really focus on how we can get long-term fixed rental properties that our people can live in. And then lastly, I noticed the number of properties that are owned by the RDA, which may go into city ownership or into some other kind of place. I think private ownership would be a bad idea. But there are many nonprofit communities in our city, and one of their great needs is for a place. And I would suggest or consider that a structure for RFPs be put together such that nonprofits could make a proposal on a level playing field, not just because so-and-so knows so-and-so, and so they get access to this piece of property, but a real RFP for all the nonprofits in our town to consider access to some of these properties that they would lease from the city, and begin to be able to build a toehold for some of their projects. And I think that's it. Thank you. This agency is just a superstar. It's just amazing what's been done. Anybody who looks at a photo survey of 30 years ago and looks at what's been done, It's amazing.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. And now I get to regress and I can ask some questions. So, anyway, I was intrigued by the notion of I think the third option that you brought forward of creating what you call it, the Community Projects and Housing Division, and how that has different obligations and you can really do more with it, although you would have less funds with which to utilize. But it sounds like you can use it for other forms of housing other than low and moderate. Are there other requirements or lack thereof that go along with that? Obviously, if you do that, that would be more of a citywide project boundary, if that's set up.
Chair Bartlett, that's exactly correct. Our boundary essentially would be the city limits. And so the funding that would come would be essentially just general fund. So the opportunity to be flexible with how we use that, we wouldn't have to be subject to any of the current laws that we're under, being that we have a project area. It would be open. We could use it for all different income levels depending on what the priorities of the community are at that particular time. We could go and address smaller capital improvements throughout the city.
So that's essentially the plus or minus 20% of the tax increment money that is now pumped back in through property tax and not into the RDA.
That's correct. Once that $20 million goes back to the county, what eventually would trickle down to the city, I'm just assuming it's 20, it's going to be a whole lot more. Probably more along the lines of 30, but my math, I get confused after 20, so I'm just going to stick with that. So about $4 million eventually comes back to the city as general fund revenue.
And then I would assume on a go-forward basis that money then would also escalate. Is that what is now $20 million today might go up to $30 million 5 years from now or whatever, and you'd get your percentage of that as well. So that number would build over time?
Chair Bartlett, that's exactly correct. As property values go up and what comes back to the county increases, so would the portion that the city would get.
Well, I know that's been, one of the struggles right now is that the RDA can only, especially on the affordable housing, you can only focus certain income groups, and the group that's really being squeezed out the most, we can't finance any projects for. So at least that type of a organization could go down that path if that was one of our priorities. And my next question is, could we set up that agency and then also do a refocused smaller RDA with some of the project limits that have been discussed by other members of the commission? Could you have both?
Chair Bartlett, I don't see why not. Because what you'd be doing is setting up a project area, a new project area, a different area.
Right.
So all the existing tax increment revenue from our current 850-acre project area goes back. That's a different source of funding. You're now bringing up tax increment financing for another project area.
So we could have a focused RDA if we identify an area that is blighted, and then we could have the overall citywide that picks up from the tax increment funds from the old RDA project site area that now come in through property tax.
Chair Bartlett, in theory, yes. Yeah. You could. That's an interesting idea that we can look further into.
Could I, Chair Bartlett, just make a caveat to that, and that would be that the 20% set-aside funds will be generating a certain amount of income in the future. We've made lots of loans that has helped develop projects, and that money, some of it will be coming back, and also interest generated from some of those loans. That money will continue to be restricted to low and moderate income housing.
Okay, now with the new agency, is there still the 80-20 split on how the money is spent, or can you spend it any way you want since it's not officially a RDA project area?
If it was not an RDA project but a city department, you could do whatever you wanted within the limits of the general municipal law. A new RDA, however, would be subject to even stricter affordable housing requirements.
Okay, and then a couple of sort of unrelated to that topic, in terms of the definition of blight and economic hardship, what about, since the harbor is included, what about the dredging of the harbor, which is absolutely vital to keep the economics alive? Can any of the RDA funds go towards something like that?
Chair Bartlett, that's an interesting question. really one thing that we always stick to that's part of the law, which is a good thing, and that is redevelopment agency funds cannot be used for maintenance or operations.
Okay.
So again, going towards those capital improvements, if I suppose we could go in and completely redredge the entire harbor, I'm just not sure if that's something that the city council would set as a priority. So maintenance and operation issues, it's always something that comes up and you wish you could fund it, but according to state law, we can't fund something of that nature.
And then in terms of how you define blight, I mean, could you put traffic congestion into that category? You know, if we were just sitting here with gridlock, could we perhaps earmark something to alleviate that aspect?
Chair Bartlett, I think traffic congestion, you could connect that to health and welfare of the community and make that connection. You know, another part of this, too, in establishing blight is it's not just us trying to go and make these findings. We're going to have, noting that the county's short on money, the school districts are short on money, they know when our sunset date is, and they know when they're going to start getting their tax increment back. So they're very keyed into this. And so if whatever we were proposing to do, if it were a new project area, they would be in discussions with us, definitely.
Okay, then I'd like to ask Sarah, what is your sense, since we're one of the first RDAs that's going to be sunsetting in terms of, since it's been so successful, is there support out there for getting a new version? Is everybody looking to us to carve the path for everybody else to follow? I mean, what do you see ahead, just based on intuition and what you've been hearing?
Well, my feeling is that, as Brian says, there are agencies out there, taxing agencies out there, that are waiting for this redevelopment agency to stop receiving the tax increment so that they can get their piece of it back. In terms of around the state, what I am getting the sense of is really successful agencies are being headed kind of down that path of ending, and the only real kind of opportunities I see are in the affordable housing area, because I think that need is still so great.
Great, thank you. Well, my comments, just briefly, because so many have already been made, is there's so many great lessons to be learned from this, and we're all sad to think that it could go away, and I hope that we can really take everything that you've learned and either apply it, even if it's in a smaller fashion, so that we can still achieve the great things that you've done. But if we can capitalize on those ideas and maybe do this citywide program in addition, I don't see a problem with perhaps pursuing both venues if that helps get us there. So I would sure like to keep the channels open on that, and I think feedback from your point of view would be really helpful as we move forward, because obviously that deadline's going to come, sooner than we all want. So, but anyway, great job. Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions from the Commission? Ms. Jacobs?
Just that this is a timely presentation, and I think I've been asking for something like this for 2 years as we're considering our 20-year general plan, because obviously in the next 20 years we will know exactly how this plays out, and to continue counting on the kind of money and funding that the RDA has provided our city as we make our general plan for the next 20 years would be imprudent, because it is a fact that this money will go away. Maybe not all of it, but most of it. And the work that is done will go away or need to be replaced in some other fashion. So thanks.
Well, and also I was worried at the beginning of this presentation that you weren't here, and you've been asking for it for 2 years, and I thought you were going to miss it. So
Mr. Chair,
I'm glad you got here.
I was stuck in line
Okay.
at a parking lot that had the full sign up, and I was car number 4. And just in terms of our RDA and our sales tax, I think we should all acknowledge that the Santa Barbara International Film Festival is doing really well this week. And there is not a parking space to be had downtown.
Well, we're glad you made it. Great. Well, thank you very much. That was an incredible presentation, and we hope to hear more down the line.
Thank you.
Okay, our next item is 3B, which is another discussion item, and this is the 5-year review of the issues in the Harbor Commercial Zone.
Scott Reedman from the Waterfront Department will be making this presentation.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bartlett, Planning Commissioners. My name is Scott Reedman. I'm the Waterfront Business Manager for the city's Waterfront Department. The zoning section in the municipal code requires a review of uses in the harbor commercial zone every 5 years from 1993. And the purpose is to ensure that there's a balance of primary and secondary uses, a balance of ocean-dependent, ocean-related, and visitor-serving uses retained in the harbor and also in the wharf to ensure that the harbor remains a working harbor. The first such report was given to the Harbor Commission and the Planning Commission in 1998, and the second one was done in 2004. And then it's forwarded on to the Coastal Commission, or I'm sure it gets filed somewhere. In terms of an outline, we really rely on two main documents, the municipal code, as I mentioned, the zoning ordinance, which defines the priority uses as primary and secondary uses. And it defines them very specifically. For instance, it'll define a primary use in the harbor as a marine fueling station or a boatyard, for example. The second document that we rely upon is the Harbor Master Plan, and it defines the priority uses a little bit differently. Ocean-dependent versus ocean-related versus visitor-serving uses. Ocean-dependent being the primary, most important use, and so on. Some examples of the ocean-dependent uses would be the slips, landing facilities such as Sea Landing and Santa Barbara Sailing Center, the dry dock, Harbor Marine Works, the boatyard. Ocean-related use, a good example would be the Blue Water Hunter Dive Shop. Doesn't necessarily need to be in the harbor, but it's ocean-related, and it's nice to have it there. It's a good fit. And then we have quite a few visitor-serving uses, which are primarily our restaurants. And the balancing act here is that the visitor-serving uses tend to generate by far the most revenue. So we've got to balance. We have to run the harbor with that revenue. An example of this would be of the 60 commercial leases that we manage in the harbor. 5 of these businesses, 5 restaurants, generate 50% of all of the lease revenue that we generate in a given year. That's the Harbor Restaurant, Brophy's, Moby Dick, Waterfront Grill, and Shoreline Beach Cafe. Those 5 businesses generate 50% of our lease revenue, so very important uses for us. This afternoon's report will focus on changes in lease changes over the past 5 years. We'll look at some of the marina slip uses, commercial fishing landings in the harbor, and some other uses in the harbor commercial zone, including business activity permits, which I'll explain later, and other boat storage opportunities. Some of the lease policies that govern what we do down at the harbor are a council resolution that basically requires us to negotiate in good faith with a existing tenant in good standing when their lease comes up for renewal, rather than just go out on the open market and select a new tenant to the highest bidder. So if the tenant's in good standing, they've been current on their rent, their insurance is in force, they've been honoring their lease, generally we pretty much negotiate with them unless they've really had some egregious problems with their tenancy. Another, not really policy, but a procedure and practice that we employ at the Waterfront Department is in the lease assignment process. And each lease has a provision for how the lease is to be assigned in case the owner decides to sell his business. And that gives the department the ability to review the financial records, the financial standing, experience and qualifications of the proposed new operator. There's a fairly modest fee of $3,000 that's paid, and it goes through the Harbor Commission and council approval process for a lease assignment to a new owner of an existing business. But critical to that procedure is when we are reviewing and processing a lease assignment is we do not change the business terms of the lease. We don't extend the term, which is a frequent request. We don't change the rent structure, and we don't change the permitted uses of the lease. So that helps prevent a lease morphing into a different type of use down at the harbor. Again, the Harbor Master Plan policy DEP 3 comes into play when a lease does come back to us and we have a vacancy to fill. This DEP 3 policy requires that we evaluate this new use in terms of, is it ocean dependent, and we prioritize the ocean dependent over ocean related and visitor serving whenever we have a new lease. Another procedure we do is we fill vacancies when they do come to us through a public process, a request for proposal process, and we advertise it. And in the actual RFP packet, we include the zoning ordinance and the policies from the Harbor Master Plan so that any applicant knows exactly the criteria that they're going to need to satisfy in the harbor. We very frequently get inquiries from folks that want to do a food service or a restaurant. And so very frequently in the RFP packet, we'll put food service, businesses containing a food service component will not be considered because everybody wants to have a T-shirt shop / with some coffee and bagels, you know, or tackle shop with sandwiches too. So we get a lot of interesting proposals in that way. And finally, unsolicited business proposals, we get those frequently too. We get calls every week from folks that want to set up something. This week I fielded an inquiry from someone who wanted to do a popcorn push cart sort of thing out on Stearns Wharf. Everybody wants to get out on Stearns Wharf. We explain to them the process and generally file the unsolicited business proposals for a later date when we might have an RFP come up. I've also had several that very interesting unsolicited proposals. I've had at least 2 of folks that wanted to operate a helicopter excursion landing on the end of Stearns Wharf and doing tours from the end of Stearns Wharf. Obvious problems with noise and bird strikes and so forth. And I once had an individual who wanted to launch a hovercraft from West Beach and do tours of the harbor in this hovercraft. So we get quite a few interesting inquiries down there at the harbor. Let's see. Moving on to ocean-dependent uses. Again, this is defined as vessel moorings, slips, and dry storage, boatyard, and the dry dock facility. These are defined in Exhibit E, or Appendix E, I believe it is, of the Harbor Master Plan. The Harbor Master Plan includes ocean-related government offices as an ocean-dependent use, including the Harbor Maintenance Office, obviously Harbor Patrol, and I believe that would encompass the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary offices in the Waterfront Center building. Appendix E of the Harbor Master Plan also lists the Santa Barbara Youth Foundation and the Yacht Club as ocean-dependent uses. Obviously, the Youth Foundation is a dock facility, and that's clearly ocean-dependent. The Appendix E does have the caveat with the Yacht Club. It notes it as an ocean-dependent use, but it also says some of this may be ocean-related versus ocean-dependent. So that's been a subject of discussion over the years. And finally, fish processing is listed as an obvious ocean-dependent use. We have a Saturday morning open-air fisherman's market on the city pier, and we have a new fish processor that we'll talk about in a moment. In terms of ocean-dependent uses, new and expanded uses, the Santa Barbara Fish Market formerly occupied about a 60-square-foot hole in the wall next to the Minnow Cafe. They operated out of coolers and fish totes. We had a tackle shop go out, not renew his lease when it came up, and we did an RFP, and the Santa Barbara Fish Market had the strongest proposal. So we moved them down the street into a 734-square-foot location on 117 Harbor Way, where they've really created quite a thriving business. Another expanded use in the past 5 years has been the Marina 4B lease area. It was one of the last undeveloped areas in the harbor at the end of Marina 4B. It's been leased in a lease status for over 50 years. The Swan was moored there under a lease agreement many years ago. Mary Pro moored the William McGaw there for quite a few years. And then when the McGaw left the harbor, we decided to look into the Marina 4B lease area and develop it as a lease area, continue to manage it under a lease structure rather than build out slips. So I'll get into that a little bit more later too. And this is beyond the scope of the 5-year study period, but the Santa Barbara Water Taxi did begin operations in late 2003, and that transports passengers for $4, I believe, currently from the harbor to Stearns Wharf and back. And he's very dedicated. He runs usually about noon to 5 or 6 p.m. and every half an hour back and forth. So that's been kind of nice to see that happen. We did lose one ocean-dependent use during this last 5-year period. Aliotti Fish Company, as a squid processor out of Monterey, fell upon hard times and pulled out, and we haven't been able to replace a squid processor on the city pier. A lot of that is due to just the lack of infrastructure we have on the city pier. The way the squid operations work is the seiners come in, you need to pump it, the wet fish material, up out of the hold of the boat, ice it down, load it in a semi, and take it out of there. And that entails bringing a 440-volt generator out onto the pier, the transvac pump that actually sucks up the fish, and then backing a semi backwards down Harbor Way in front of the Minnow Cafe. So you can imagine the difficulty in keeping this going. So we'd like to someday get a squid processor back, but not at this time. So this is just a little enhanced picture of the Santa Barbara Fish Market. If you've been down there, you know it's a place of bustling activity, quite a variety of fresh fish, local and from Alaska and other areas. And Brian Colgate and his crew have built that into quite a thriving business that serves many of the local markets and restaurants. So he has a big retail business as well as wholesale business and even brokering. He'll buy directly from the boats at the city pier, frequently halibut, large shipments of sea bass, more than the local market can absorb, and he'll ship them down to L.A. and overseas even in some cases. And this is a better picture of the build-out in Marina 4B. These are called Mediterranean-style mooring, where the vessels moor stern to the dock structure between those piles. We developed 3 mooring spaces for larger vessels where only one was able to moor before. And we developed this project in concert with NOAA's Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary vessel Shearwater, which you see there on the right. And we were able to get advance payment of $100,000 from the federal government in order to develop this area. So their rent is now paid 5 years in advance, but we got a capital infusion to do this project. The boat in the middle is a pleasure craft, the Philippa, and that was selected through a request for proposal process. Same deal. We were able to solicit 5 years of rent in advance in developing the project. And then the third berth is a whale watching vessel used in Captain Don's whale watching on Stearns Wharf, which has since left the harbor. We utilize this as a visiting berth now until Don's operation sorts itself out and he either gets back into whale watching or we do an RFP for another whale watching concession on the wharf. One of the last undeveloped areas in the harbor, though. Moving on to ocean-related uses. Some of the new and expanded uses are a result of the vacancy of Fred Gamble, who operated Channel Crossings Press out of the Marine Center building at 125 Harbor Way. And those are the nautical charts you might have seen of some of the Channel Islands. They're available in all the marine hardware stores and so forth. Fred got out of the business, sold it, and vacated essentially 4 offices. It was we did RFPs for these offices, and we selected Mike Pizell, a marine surveyor, for one of the offices. Again, through the RFP process, Sunset Kid Yacht Sales, an existing yacht broker in the building, had a good proposal to expand because one of the offices was located adjacent to his existing office, and there was even a door already there. So that was an easy pick. We had some other vacancies in the 125 building, the Marine Center building. We had 3 ground floor offices that we held off the market for several years pending the Chandlery building remodel. And that was so we could accommodate Chandlery yacht sales while the building, known as the Chandlery building, was torn apart and reconstructed. We did an RFP for those offices after the building was complete, and the Chandlery yacht sales proposal was the most fitting for the 125 building. It gave them better visibility than they previously had, and it kind of clusters all our brokers together in that same building with Seacoast Yacht Sales and Sunset Kid Yacht Sales. Additionally, there are some offices behind our administration offices in the Chandlery building above what is now West Marine, and we also put those out through an RFP, and the Chandlery was the successful proposer on those offices as well. So those are administrative offices of the Chandlery. So moving on to visitor serving uses, some of the new and expanded uses were the addition of Verizon Wireless. We negotiated a 25-year lease at $18,000 a year to utilize an underused location in the harbor, which we refer to down there as the trash triangle. It's a small triangle between the boatyard and the yacht club where the Marburg bins are. There was a little extra room in that area that was not conducive to any other type of development, so Verizon put their equipment shelter in there, and the antenna for the cell site is concealed on the chimney of the Waterfront Center building, which of course was subject to HLC review. I don't think anybody really knows it's there. It's quite well camouflaged. This gave the harbor a lot better cell phone service. It was really substandard out in Marina One. You'd get dropped calls all the time, and the Verizon site on the Mesa was very overloaded. So this has enhanced the ability of boaters and visitors and marina users in their cell phone use. Another visitor serving use from the offices that Fred Gamble vacated, we did an RFP for 2 more of them. Brophy Brothers Administrative Offices was a successful proposal on one of them, and the other was an outfit called Marina Network, and they provide Wi-Fi service in the harbor now, primarily for visiting boaters, but permanent slip holders can avail themselves of the service as well. Marina Network also offers 2 computer workstations, which you can, visiting boaters or anybody can walk in, and if you need to access, check your email or whatever, you can do that at Marina Network. And then he has fax and color printing capability and some office type services like that, again, primarily for visiting boaters. Lease assignments. A couple of years ago, Breakwater Teas, which was formerly owned by Bob Keating, was sold to Brophy Brothers. This is in the 119 building under the Brophy Brothers restaurant and immediately adjacent to their clam bar. And this is where our lease assignment procedure really came into play, because we had concerns due to the proximity to the Brophy Brothers clam bar that this would try to morph into being absorbed into the restaurant operation. So we made it very clear in our lease assignment approval process that this would not become a food service business and would not be absorbed into the Brophy's operation. We were a little skeptical at first, but actually Brophy's has done quite well in the clothing business. They upgraded the inventory from basic imprinted T-shirts and so forth, and the sales have increased remarkably, and it's a percentage rent lease, so the payments to the department have also increased correspondingly. A real success story there. Didn't know Brophy's had a knack for the restaurant business and the retail business, but they do. Another lease that we've seen turn over 3 times since I've been at the department is Sushi Go Go right next door, a little 198 square foot sushi restaurant. We've seen 3 different owners there. With each time, we've seen an improvement in the operation, an improvement in the sales. But again, no change in the permitted uses as a part of the lease assignment process. And this is just another look at the retail store at Brophy's, which they refer to as the store at Brophy's. And if you ever get down there, go take a look at that picture on the wall behind the cash register there. You'll see some familiar faces of the Brophy's employees and owners. They're all real people in that painting there. It's kind of interesting. Moving on to Stearns Wharf. The Harbor Master Plan acknowledges that Stearns Wharf is primarily a visitor serving, with the possible exception of the bait and tackle shop. Some of the expanded uses: in 2002, the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History demolished the Nature Conservancy building and the old Sea Center building, and replaced it with one larger building encompassing both spaces. Well into the project, their engineering determined that they were going to have to upgrade the wharf as well, so they ended up demolishing a good portion of the shoreward finger of Stearns Wharf and replacing that with steel pile and concrete pad underneath the building, which they weren't expecting to do initially. They were a little perturbed at their engineer. But it came out, and the new Ty Warner Sea Center opened in April of 2005. And another minor expansion during this time period was Santa Barbara Shellfish Company received a coastal development permit in August of 2005 to increase their trash enclosure a little bit to assist with recycling. and also add 4 outdoor tables to its west side of the building underneath the overhanging eave. And this is just a photo of the interior of the new Ty Warner Sea Center with the famous gray whale and calf. And this is the new benches, tables at Shellfish that were recently installed. This is right after they were installed. They're physically connected to the building, and the benches are affixed too, so they don't move around on the wharf. It was a priority of the Coastal Commission that the perimeter walkway not be encroached upon. Some of the other lease changes on Stearns Wharf, again, these are lease assignments. Well, I'll start with the Coastal Treasures. We did have a vacancy at 217 E Stearns Wharf. It's one of the 2 evictions I've had to do in the 12 years I've been at the department. Tenant was not living up to the lease. Unfortunately, had to result in an eviction. We did a request for proposals, and Coastal Treasures was the best proposal that we received. They also used to operate the Leather Depot at 909 State Street, which has since moved on. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but that was a nice store. And they continue to operate some stores up in their main store up in Big Bear. But Coastal Treasures is a new use located through an RFP. We had a number of lease assignments. In 2006, Old Wharf Trading Company and Topside were transferred to a new owner. Also, Mother Stearns Candy Company was transferred to a new owner, and they did a substantial upgrade, cosmetic upgrade mostly, to Mother Stearns Candy, and the sales have absolutely doubled. If you haven't been in there in a couple of years, it's much improved over what it was before. Char West, John Williams sold Char West and Great Pacific Ice Cream to his longtime manager of 20 years, Francisco Aguilera. You might have read about that in the paper. It was a real kind of heartwarming story how that all worked out. And Stearns Wharf Bait and Tackle transferred from its old owner to a new owner in 2005. And this is a picture of the inside of Stearns Wharf Bait and Tackle. As you can see, it's absolutely stuffed with new and used fishing tackle, which is for sale and also for rent. So people can come down and rent a fishing rod, and you don't need a fishing license to fish from Stearns Wharf. So for a minimal cost, families can go down and rent a fishing rod and enjoy an afternoon of fishing from the pier. In terms of vacant lease space, the waterfront department is virtually 100% leased on Stearns Wharf and in the harbor. We have very low lease turnover. As I mentioned, we have ownership change hands, but we very, very rarely have lease turnover. We do have one vacant space, and that's the one I mentioned earlier, the hole in the wall that the fish market was in. It's adjacent to the Minnow Cafe. We demoed the space and expanded it from 60 square feet to about 190, and we're not planning on doing an RFP for this space. The utilities are commingled with the Minnow Cafe. There are some county environmental health department issues where the space cannot be used by anybody other than Minnow Cafe just because of the proximity and the plumbing and whatnot. So Minnow Cafe is working on a development plan for that space. If you're familiar with the Minnow Cafe, they could use every inch they can get. So we're working on that one too. Moving on to the commercial fishing industry in Santa Barbara Harbor. I don't have 2009 landing figures in yet, but the value of the 2008 landings were $7.2 million, and that's the ex-vessel price, which means that's the price that was paid to the fishermen for their catch. An industry standard is a times 4 multiplier for the actual value of the commercial fishing fleet in Santa Barbara. So the value of that $7.2 million in fish landings extrapolates out to $25 to $30 million a year in terms of the overall benefit to the local economy from Santa Barbara's fishing fleet. The primary sources of the landings are sea urchin. We're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, sea urchin port, red sea urchin. Additionally, lobster, crab, halibut, white sea bass, sea cucumber of all things, and ridgeback shrimp are landed seasonally in Santa Barbara Harbor. It's kind of interesting. Sea urchin is, by volume, our highest product that's landed at the harbor, with 4 million pounds being landed in 2008 of a value of $2.5 million to the fishermen. Urchin is an example of a high-volume, low-price product that's landed at our harbor. The opposite end of the spectrum, as you can imagine, would be something like lobster, where we land quite a bit less lobster, but it's worth $10 to $15 a pound, $15 a pound wholesale right now. So we have a variety of fisheries at the harbor, a variety of seasons, and I brought some detail if the Commission is interested in how many hagfish landings we had last year or whatnot. The fishermen, we have designated commercial fishing slips in Marina 1A Finger, also Fish Float North, which is the L-shaped dock in front of Brophy Brothers, and Fish Float South, which is the dock in front of the West Marine and the Harbor Patrol office there. Those are specifically for commercial fishing vessels that are actively engaged in commercial fishing. They need to provide evidence of minimal landings via their fish landing receipts to be eligible, and in turn they get a substantially discounted rate in those slips. This is just a photograph of a kelp cutter that goes out and cuts the canopies off some of the kelp beds, and this is shipped up north, I believe, to Santa Maria area, and it's used as food for an abalone mariculture operation.
If you could try and wrap up the presentation. I know 6 of us have been here since 9 o'clock this morning, and we've seen quite a bit so far, and I think most of us are familiar. So
okay,
that would be
I
appreciated.
can certainly do that. Again, there's urchin trucks being unloaded. You can see that most any evening in the harbor. In terms of slip uses, about 10% of this, or 8% of the slips are used for commercial fishing, and the balance are used for recreational. We have 97 liveaboard permits out of a possible 113. In the past, we've had a waiting list. We no longer do. We have a minimum of 30 visitor slips that we are required to keep available for transiting vessels per the municipal code, but at any given time we have 2 to 3 times that many because we use people's slips when they leave on temporary cancellation or they leave the harbor for more than 5 days. Other harbor changes is the installation of the mooring area off of East Beach. We also sell beach storage permits for catamarans and outriggers, which run about $200 to $250 a year and allow them to store their catamarans or outriggers on the beach. And we have business activity permits, which we use to regulate the service businesses in the harbor. These encompass 12 charter permits and anywhere around 70 service permits, and they just require that the people working behind the marina gates have a Santa Barbara business license and a minimum level of insurance. Again, that's Cat Beach with a race going on. And to wrap up the upcoming uses, you're familiar with the West Beach feasibility study being conducted by Pat Saley. They've done some community outreach studying current uses and looking into possible future uses on West Beach. And that was, I know, presented to you a month or 2 back in a combined meeting, which I watched from the safety and relative comfort of my own home. And that's the outrigger beach storage on West Beach. And that concludes the report. I'd be happy to answer any questions. We believe that the policies ensure the harbor is remaining a working harbor.
Great. Thank you very much. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very quickly, I have 2. How'd the moorings fare in the storms?
Good question. The only one vessel of the 9 or so that washed up in the most recent storms was from the permitted mooring area.
Okay.
It was not the failure of the mooring, it was a failure of the bow line attached to the mooring.
Okay, thank you. And my other question is, I was reading through this report, and it says that the commercial fishing is given priority status in the Harbor Master Plan. And the policy states, strive to maintain a minimum of 19% of the slips for commercial fishing. And then just down from that, under slip uses, it says 8% of harbor slips are used by commercial fishing. And then in your report you said, 9%, excuse me, which I corrected to 8%. So is 19 like a potential number that's unfilled, or are you a wish list and we don't have enough fishermen for that, or boats, or is, why do we have a difference in those two numbers? If 19 is the goal, I think it wouldn't be that hard to fill.
19 is an old number. I apologize, I didn't catch it in the body of the report. I've got updated figures from our staff, and we believe 8 or 9% is the current level. Due to marine protected areas, closures at the islands, and so forth, that number of vessels has dwindled.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was one of those 6, so I'll hustle along also. I'm going to screw up the initials, but in my outdoor news every week for the past 5 years, they're in a process to restrict the fishing grounds out in the channel, and it's probably like the MFLPA or something. But in relationship to our commercial fisheries and what they bring in here, are you guys tracking that, and what are you anticipating that will do when those areas begin restricting for any type of fishing, and how it will relate to keeping a feasible commercial fishing operation going in our harbor?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan, a good question. The Marine Life Protected Areas, the MLPA initiative, has been enacted at the Channel Islands. It was expanded at the Channel Islands, and the current process that's underway is bringing the Marine Life Protected Areas to the coast. They've enacted a few protected areas up north. Right now, the study is Southern California, Point Conception, south to San Diego. Our harbor operations manager, Mick Cronman, is very engaged in that process. As a former commercial fisherman, he is doing his best to advance the needs of our commercial fishing fleet and the importance of our commercial fishing fleet to the economics of the harbor and the feel and ambiance in the harbor and the culture of commercial fishing in Santa Barbara Harbor. It will have a negative effect. It's most likely to the sport boat that operates out of Sea Landing. It'll shut down some of the critical areas that recreational and the sport boat use, most likely Naples Reef area complex. There will be other areas that will still be able to fish. The trawl fleet that does the cucumbers and the white sea bass and the halibut will still have plenty of areas to fish. Lobster may be reduced somewhat. It will have an effect. It will have a negative effect on our commercial fishing fleet, no doubt. How much of a negative effect, time will tell.
Thank you. Just one other question, just generally, I'll learn more. I'm your new designee to the Harbor Commission, so next month you'll actually see me there to say hello. But in leases, whether it's slips or business leases or commercial fishing spots, is there any type of incentive or given to local residents versus out-of-city residents? Is that any part of the process, or is it just an open process to anybody?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Jordan. Okay. It's open to anybody, basically. Anybody can transfer into a slip or transfer into a lease. When we advertise an RFP, we give priority not really to where they're from, but their business credentials and experience and their financial standing.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. First, I'd like to commend the Waterfront Department because over the years, I've seen tremendous economic vitality and use of the waterfront. I think it's been improved vastly, both for locals and visitors. And I know that many of these enterprises, both for-profit and non-profit, are really struggling. So I'm wondering, in order to continue to support that economic vitality, if there's proactive outreach by your department to the leaseholders to ensure that you're sort of monitoring their well-being, their financial well-being, for robust collaboration, as it were.
Yes, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schwartz. The Waterfront Department is actively engaged in the Stearns Wharf and the Harbor Merchants Associations. We're dues-paying ex officio members. Can't vote, but we can pay the dues. We engage in cooperative advertising and promotion programs to support them. We did some ads on Cox this year with each association, different type of ads. We produce a nice watercolor brochure, which we distribute in the San Fernando Valley and around the Tri-Counties to get the word out there. And probably one of our biggest promotional efforts is the Harbor Festival, which is the newly revamped Harbor Festival, which is now on its 7th or 8th year. And that's just huge. The tenants really appreciate that, and it brings a lot of people down, both local and visitors, that might not otherwise know about the harbor. And our hope is that they'll enjoy it and they'll come back on a different day. And in fact, it's just a one-day event on Saturday, but I've talked to Steve Hislop at the Waterfront Grill, and he says he actually sees a spike in business on Sunday after the festival from people coming down thinking it's a two-day festival, and they go to his restaurant because the festival isn't happening. So we are proactive in trying to support our lessees.
Commissioner Jacobs, I believe you're next.
Thank you. Actually, that makes me think of something I had suggested at the improvements discussion that we had a couple months ago regarding the beachfront and the kayak housing and so on, that the merchants could have a presence during Fiesta, and it could be a kind of El Mercado del Mar. The harbor area is a really beautiful area to visit, both for those of us that live here and for people who are visiting from out of town, and the Harbor Festival is a great example of that. But that's an aside. The question I have, there's a long answer and a short answer, and I'm really looking for the short answer, just a snapshot. I know that the relationship between Parks and Rec and Harbor has been redrawn a little bit recently regarding who cleans up the boats. And maybe I have it wrong, but there's been some change in how boats that are washed ashore are taken care of and who pays for that and how the fees work and so on. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how that's going.
Commissioner Jacobs, it's going well. Parks traditionally has the heavy equipment that we do not have, so they would doze or get skip loaders down there and take away the boats. We have obtained from the Department of Boating and Waterways AWAF grant, Abandoned Watercraft Abatement Grant, and so we get reimbursed for about 90% of the cost of abandoned boats that go up on the beach. So we have now gotten more involved in the process of removing the boats. We hire Marburg, and they have got all the equipment. We contract with Marburg. You probably saw it in the paper a week or so ago. And they scoop up the boats, put them in a bin, take them away, recycle the aluminum masts and the lead in the keel, and I think they did $10,000 was the cost to us, and we'll get 90% of that reimbursed from the state. It's a very important program, statewide, the AWAF program.
That is great news. Thanks.
Commissioner Jordan, did you have another comment? Your light is still on, so. Okay. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know this isn't part of the leasing and so on and the commercial activities in the harbor, but critical to the harbor is the dredging. That has been in the past paid for by federal funds. Is that still the case? And in the past, I know the harbor has tried to expand the area that's being dredged, so there's more room, more water. What's happening with that, or is that an area that you're familiar with?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Lodge. We're currently wrapping up the final stage of a 3-year contract through the Army Corps of Engineers with AIS Construction as the contractor. In a couple of weeks, if the gray whale leaves, we will start the regular dredging process, the twice yearly seasonal dredging process for the federal channel. We have received money for the next 3-year cycle in the President's budget for that, for additional dredging. Unfortunately, due to this economic stimulus projects that are out there, all of the dredge companies are very busy right now, and correspondingly, the costs have skyrocketed. So we're very concerned, even though we've been given a very generous allocation in the President's budget, that it will not be sufficient because of the high cost that the dredging is now. We have a second dredging project starting up, which I think you're referring to, in expanding the water area along West Beach. And if all goes according to plan, that should also start in 2 to 3 weeks, and that will involve picking up sand off West Beach and shipping it up to Goleta Beach to help re-nourish Goleta Beach. We hope to have that paid for by other agencies.
Thank you. What are we talking about in dollar amount these days on an annual basis for the dredging?
It varies anywhere from 1.9 to, $2.2 million per year for the dredging.
Thank you. I also know at one time the city was attempting to buy a dredge of its own so that it could do the dredging when, wouldn't run into this problem where the dredges are busy elsewhere. Is that something that's still considered?
That was a program that was offered, if I recall correctly, by the federal government, and they were going to put forward some money so that Santa Barbara could buy its own dredge. We resisted that because the real cost is not necessarily the dredge, but maintaining it and running it. So we resisted. Santa Cruz Harbor took them up on it, and they have regretted it ever since. So we hope that the structure of the dredge funding stays the way it is.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. My turn. I have one question that relates to sort of the economic operations of the harbor, and I don't know if it's maybe just my perception because I haven't really been intimately involved, but I've heard just stories through others, and that's regarding it's the lease or the transfer of boat slips, where obviously the city values them at a certain amount, but if you go through a yacht broker or somebody that's selling a boat, it's like way more than that, and it seems like I sense that the yacht brokers get in and get all the slips and park derelict boats there and then get highway robbery prices to sell the slips to somebody else. And I hope that's not the case. It kind of reminds me of, the realtors always snapping up the foreclosures that never make it to the public. So I've just heard stories that the slips are way more than what the city actually leases them for. So can you hopefully tell me I'm wrong on that, or are we missing a real economic opportunity that others are taking advantage of?
Mr. Chair, the way we've addressed this through our slip transfer policy is that we've increased, each and every year, we've increased the per foot cost when someone comes in to transfer their boat and their slip. It's now upwards of a $600,000 line item in our budget. So we hope to get each year a bigger and bigger bite of that chunk that is transferred when one owner transfers their vessel to another. Then the new owner of the vessel gets rid of that vessel and brings in their own vessel. So there are substantial slip transfer fees involved, and the department does benefit from that. Our concern in eliminating that slip transferability is that it will simply drive it underground. And again, a good example of what happened there is up in Santa Cruz. So by not driving it underground and managing it, we do get significant revenue from that.
Okay, I just want to make sure somebody's got their eye on it. I'm just judging from a distance with what I've heard and don't really know the details, but I've kind of heard those rumors, so I appreciate the explanation. Thank you. Is there anything else from the Commission? Ms. Schwartz?
Yes, thank you, Chair Bartlett. One other question came to mind. I know this is a very popular waterfront, again, for both visitors and probably potential lessees. Do we have a waiting list of lessees who are interested in, Verizon? I'm curious how they came to us for this very unique and I think very creative solution to camouflaging their cell site. Could you speak to that?
Sure, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schwartz. Verizon was kind of an interesting case. I had a property management specialist working at the department whose previous job experience was he worked for, I believe it's JM Consulting, and what he did was go out and do contracts with cell sites. So he brought this expertise to the job. And so we said, let's see if we can make something from nothing in this trash area. And he contacted a number of cell site providers, and Verizon was the one that bit. We looked at others, but they weren't interested. In terms of a wait list for tenants, we maintain a database of people that call. And that's when we get an opening, we send out a mailer to everybody. I've got a list going back probably 5 or 8 years. And we send out a list the RFP to everybody who's expressed an interest in office space, retail space, or whatever it might be. So we don't have a wait list per se, but we do have a contact list if anything comes available.
Great. Is there any other feedback that you need from us?
No, I appreciate the comments, and I apologize for the length of time you had to be in this room today.
Well, there's a lot of components involved, and I think most of us are pretty thoroughly convinced that you're taking the best advantage of all the parts and pieces. So thank you very much for the detail on that.
Thank you.
Our last item on the agenda will be our administrative portion. First of all would be the committee and liaison reports. Do you have anything to report from the staff hearing officer?
The staff hearing officer had a meeting, and it went with no glitches, and there were some mods granted, but nothing controversial. And if you look at the show agenda, it's lightened up considerably, as you can see. And I think, well, there's not much on it, so it'll be light reports, light agenda.
Okay, and I did notice that you attended the ABR meeting on Monday.
I certainly did. Thank you for reminding me that I was there.
And I also watched it live, so maybe between the two of us, we can report on what happened. Go ahead if you want. You were there.
Well, I actually was going kind of as a looky-loo to have a look at the 825 De La Vina project, which had come before us and had not a lot of neighborhood output, but concerned neighbors, because there's not a lot of neighbors around it of residential, that one in the rear and then an office building on the, is it north? Yeah. And then the residents to the immediate other side. And it's an improved project for sure. I don't want to give away too much because they're going to have to come back to us. But
Well, I did watch it as well, and I think ABR is satisfied with the changes, and the motion was continued to the Planning Commission. So
Right.
it will be working its way back.
We'll be seeing it, right.
It won't be going back to ABR before we see it.
no,
So.
it's coming to us. So it'll get on in our queue somewhere there.
And then with interest, I watched the following item, which was the
Yes.
617 Bradbury, even though it won't be coming back here. I know it was originally an appeal of one of our denials. So that was
That
interesting
went to
to
City
watch.
Council, right.
Right.
That was interesting to watch too.
I mean-
They Victorianized the building
Right,
and called it Italianate.
right.
So,
It's got a ways to go, and it was continued back to the full board.
yep.
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
on that
Danny.
one, that for 617 Bradbury, they did reduce the building by about 630, 640 square feet.
Yeah, about 635, I think it was,
Oh,
square feet.
And the direction
The
that
rear.
they got from the council was to reduce it by about 500. So it seems like it needs some architectural work and a little bit of size, bulk, and scale, especially the back part, the three-story portion. But it seems like it's come a decent ways, not all the way that it needs to.
Right, no, I noticed that as well, but they did put an emphasis on, there was an amount that needed to be reduced, but it was at least. They said, well, you've gone beyond it, but it doesn't mean you've necessarily satisfied us yet, so
And the
you have to be
neighbors were
careful
there.
about the wording.
Yeah, we don't want to
Yeah.
miss that the neighbors came out.
Right, no, it won't be coming back to us, but
No.
since it was here originally, I thought people
Right.
would like to know.
Right.
Any other committee or liaison reports? Ms. Schwartz?
Thank you, Chair Bartlett. Speaking of a long day, I started at 7:30 this morning, taking over for Commissioner Lodge at the Downtown Parking Committee. So I do have a short readout from that committee. The good news on the bright side is that revenues to fiscal date are on track for our parking revenues. Hourly parking's just down by about 1%. The parking build revenues, however, overall are down 33, and there are some gap closure strategies that they're working on for that. But the monthly parking fees are up by 13%. So here's a bright spot for that committee, and they're going to look to see how they can enhance the offerings of and the attractiveness of monthly parking fees. And perhaps Commissioner Lodge, they've probably revisited this in the past, but it's come back around. From their consultants' recommendations, new technology in terms of parking meters are definitely being considered. And I could tell that there are pros and cons and supporters and opponents of putting this sort of technology in downtown Santa Barbara. I think much more dialogue, I sensed, was going to take place before any decision is made. But the good news is about a change in the city parking lots is that as of July 1, they're going to roll out credit cards. So you can now pay that way at the city lots a little bit later this year. And the overall revenues projected for this year are about $4.3 million. So I'll continue to keep you posted, and I'm looking forward to participating with this committee. It's a good group.
Great. Well, thanks for taking that on, especially from Miss Lodge. I know that was you had
That was
a
a
lot
committee.
of meetings that you went to on that. So
Well, I always found it interesting.
Right.
And as I think I said, it was always kind of a read back on the economy and the state of society in terms of what's happening that shouldn't be happening in the parking structures and so on. So I always found it interesting. And as Commissioner Schwartz said, it's a good group.
If I could just make one more comment, speaking of sort of this is emblematic of the fuller picture downtown. I think one issue that this committee and the merchants are grappling with is how to continue to build revenues, but make their businesses accessible and inviting, provide for traffic circulation, and just balancing all of this, I think, is something they're going to work very hard on this year. So I'm looking forward to hearing their dialogue and decision-making on that.
great, thank you. Is there any others? Okay, before I adjourn the meeting, even though this was our first Thursday meeting in this month, for us, we don't have First Thursday to go to, but we do have the film festival instead, so I think there's plenty to do. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.